Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Randy Rosin, who is a faculty member of the National Intelligence University in Bethesda, Maryland, who teaches courses in propaganda, foreign information and cyber strategy, cyber threat intelligence, denial and deception, and leadership. He's a 32-year active duty Army veteran who has served in combat arms, psychological operations, information operations, as a Middle Eastern Foreign Area Officer, and in human intelligence operations. Randy Rosin, welcome back to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, John, it's good to be back.
To our audience, there will be a link in the show notes to Randy's previous episode, which was way back up at the top of the podcast, maybe like September of 2020, I think, and we discussed cybernetics. So please check that out if you like, and I'm sure we'll probably touch on some similar topics during the course of this discussion. But the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Randy, will cover reflexive control. But before we get into this topic, do you think we could start by getting your current hot take on our strategic landscape?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the big thing that's coming up is our election cycle, and of course that presents the Russians with opportunity for some mischief. Except, this time around, last time was kind of a bit of surprise about the degree of the Russian activities, but I think this time around it has the potential to be more serious because there's a segment of those involved in our politics that include elected officials that are more or less Russian sympathizers. So they can act as agents of influence to facilitate Russian activities, and those inside of government, particularly the elected officials, can actively prevent government agencies from taking actions to counter Russian interference. So, I think this poses some problems this election cycle that we did not have in previous cycles.
All right. Okay, great. Follow up there. So we're recording this on March the 7th, 2024. Not too long ago, a couple of weeks ago, Tucker Carlson, had his interview with Vladimir Putin. Do you have any, comments related to that interview? Either the actual interview itself of a Western journalist interviewing Vladimir Putin, just that event, or the content of the information that Vladimir Putin passed along during the course of that interview. Do you kind of get what I'm asking? Take it either way. What's your hot take on that interview?
Well, I can't speak to Tucker Carlson's motivations,
Sure.
But strictly from the Russian perspective, clearly he is a viable agent of influence, and agents of influence can either be witting or non-witting, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure which one. I can't. I'm not in the mind of Tucker Carlson, so I can't say for sure if he really believes in his conviction or perception about the Russians being like good guys, or it's a cynical kind of ploy for him to gain audience and be relevant. But from the Russian perspective, I just I'm aware of what President Putin, what he thought of afterwards. It was, I think Jon Stewart made some fun of it, or one of the late night talk show
Oh,
hosts.
oh
But
yeah, I'm sure.
uh,
Yeah,
from
yeah.
from the Russian perspective, I think they would call him a useful idiot. And based upon Putin's reaction, where he was like expecting like a serious journalist to interview him that may be throwing softballs at him, but
Mm,
he was basically afterwards, he's like, well, he,
mm.
this guy didn't ask me any questions or anything. And apparently Putin really wanted to be challenged in the way that he's used to when he's
Ah,
speaking to other Western journalists, like either BBC or Deutsche Welle, or the French press agency. He's used to hard-boiled questions like that, but he was clearly not ready for this type of
hmm.
useful idiot to
Wow.
run the interview.
Oh, okay. All right. Cool. Yeah. What one more, uh, semi-related item before we get into reflexive control. So you've got a pretty nifty project going that you've called the propaganda universe. Do you think you could give just take a moment and tell our audience about this project and where they can find out more info?
Yeah, thanks for asking about it. Yeah, so I started Propaganda Universe because throughout um, my PhD program, my PhD is in communication, and then my background as a operator, I guess you could, as a PSYOP or an IO, I guess you could say that, well, that's our version of a propagandist. Uh, and surveying the sort of the information landscape, uh, I really became concerned about the degree to which our communication is dominated by manipulative communication, which is a way that's like an umbrella term that I use to describe communication that includes some type of artifice and influencing a target audience to do something or not do something. So so I was kind of uh I was I spent my life in national security, uh, and so this seemed to be like something related to our own national security, that we need to preserve our ability to make decisions that are in our best interests and not those of somebody else. So with that in mind, like I created this this venue called Propaganda Universe,
Mhm.
and it includes I produce YouTube videos, podcast, and there's also a website. But basically, my intent of Propaganda Universe is to serve as an educational venue to help citizens, scholars, policymakers, and journalists understand the nature of propaganda, disinformation, and information warfare. So I want to provide knowledge to audiences that is informed by my both practice as a propagandist and as a scholar, so that we're able to mitigate the effects of manipulative communication.
Yeah, yeah, very cool. And so there'll be a link in the show notes for those to go check out that YouTube channel and the other resources that you have available. So please go do that. All right, so on to reflexive control. So Randy and I, we collaborated back and forth a little bit, and put together some questions to help unpack this Soviet technique. And so we'd like to start by kind of setting the stage a little bit and just ask you, Randy, if there are some important background concepts or any intellectual history or philosophical underpinnings that might be important to understand up front before actually getting into what reflexive control is. So do you think maybe we could start off that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to place reflexive control that we're concerned about in the greater context of Russian geopolitical strategy. So we look at we have and we in the West we have a way of categorizing Russian activities, the things that they do in pursuit of their geopolitical objectives, as being hybrid or gray zone warfare. Um, but what they do is they describe it in terms of being a strategy of the indirect approach. Um, so the indirect approach is something that is derived from a British military theorist, Basil Liddell Hart, and a smattering of Sun Tzu type of philosophy. And what they are is a complex of preventive, preemptive, retaliatory actions meant to affect informational, temporal, and spatial allocation of power capabilities, short of entering armed confrontation. So it's basically what we refer to as political warfare.
Mm,
Everything that a country does, all the tools that they have available to them, they use in pursuit of geopolitical objectives. So within that, and the reason why they call it the indirect approach is because they know that they cannot, Russia versus NATO and Western alliances, they recognize that they are the weaker of the two sides. So
mm,
so they've adopted this indirect approach. So information confrontation is the information tool or concept. Like we have dime, right?
mm, mm,
Diplomatic, information, military, economic. So information confrontation is the information component of the indirect approach.
mm. I see.
So they prefer to use information confrontation as opposed to information warfare because there's a lot of debate in their literature about like warfare. What is warfare? And so they prefer to use the term warfare uh, for armed conflict. And they were like, stop this. We use war as a metaphorical reference to almost anything, the war on drugs, the war on this, that.
Mhm.
So it has more of we use it more in a metaphorical sense, but in a practical application sense, when legally there are legal standards for what is considered to be armed conflict or open conflict. So um, and their theorists like to make that distinction. So that's why they've moved. That's why they prefer to call it information confrontation. So information confrontation, and the way that it is defined is uh, they call it the struggle in the information space. That's their version of the information environment that involves influencing or achieving an effect against an opposing party's informational resources and protecting one's own informational resources per se. So that's their definition, and that reads. You could superimpose our
Mm,
legacy definition of information operations on that definition. But as opposed to we here in the West, the Russians actually have a theory which underlies their information confrontation concept. And this theory is referred to as an information cybernetic theory.
Hmm.
So, cybernetics is the granddaddy of control theories, and it's uh, controlling the control of purposeful systems through feedback loops, and most importantly, negative feedback loops.
Hmm.
So this is the theory that we apply in engineering and in our computers. It's John Boyd's OODA loop. Boyd was riffing off of cybernetic cycles control theory to come up with his OODA loop theory. And thermostats, our own
Mm-hmm.
bodies operate according to cybernetic processes, and that we have to maintain a certain temperature for our organs to function. So, we operate according to that uh, theory as well. So, but relative to uh, what the Russians, their information cybernetic theory, uh, they channel the original notion of what cybernetics was from Norbert Wiener in
Mm-hmm.
1940. He was the uh, physicist, philosopher, mathematician who conceived of cybernetics. And so his notion of cybernetics was control and communication in the animal and the machine. So in the sense that you you could, so according to cybernetics, you can control both humans and machines along the same, using the same process. Um, but of course, machines are machines, humans are humans. Your methods and techniques for doing so are different. So with this in mind, uh, they look at objects that exist in the information space, their information environment, are classified as being either information psychological, where the object of impact is human, and information technical, the object of impact being a technical system, think cyber or electronic warfare.
Mm-hmm.
And by thinking in turn, now it's important that, in the US Western system, our focus is on capabilities like uh, like PSYOP, cyber, electronic warfare.
I see. Yeah.
But the Russians think in terms of impact rather than on specific capabilities. Now, what this does is that it avoids placing constraints on how objects in the system can be affected. So, for example, an information technical based operation can be used to achieve an impact on informational psychological objects or humans. So an example of this is in the 2016 election cycle. Um, a lot of focus was placed on what the IRA was doing and tinkering with on Twitter and Facebook and all that kind of
That's
stuff.
that's the bot farms, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that we're operating on Twitter. So a lot of the media and scholarly attention was placed on that. Now, if one of the best books, if anybody wants to read something that is uh, that is like really credible, is Kathleen Hall Jamieson's book, Cyber War, and it's her analysis. And she's a august communication scholar. She holds an Annenberg Chair of Communication. If you're an Annenberg Chair, that's like a four-star general rank.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
So she's totally legit. And she said the thing that swayed the election more than anything else, more than, and she presents all her research in this book. is the cyber operation that the Russians did to extract the Democratic committee's emails, and then their release of that timed at strategic points during the election. And one being the most strategic release of these emails and server materials was the week prior to the election, and which influenced Comey to open an investigation. So right prior to the election, the news media cycle, like on Sundays, we're talking about Hillary and what's in the emails, and so that people went to the polls, at least the undecided numbers, uh, you know, okay, who am I going to vote for? Right. And it's like, oh, okay, I got to vote this week. Right. And this is like the people who can be influenced, they don't make up their mind until the last week. This is what political communication theory tells us. And the body of knowledge that we have about elections and political communication. So people went to the polls thinking like, oh, Hillary's a crook, and
Yeah.
so she, more than anything else, that's according to Jameson what influenced the election. Now, so in this case, in this case, they used a information technical operation, which was the extraction, was the cyber operation to breach the DNC servers and to extract the information. And then it turned into an intelligence operation to move that information to WikiLeaks. So it was an information technical operation to achieve information psychological effects. So their use of, and this is their preference, is to, we look at cyber operations as being an end in and of themselves, zeros and ones. We're maneuvering zeros and ones. The Russians, by and large, use cyber operations to achieve a psychological effect. So, yeah. So, yeah. So this is how. So they look. If you look at what they're doing in Ukraine, their physical actions on the ground are to achieve their targeting strategy is to achieve an information psychological effects against the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian forces, rather than like a focus on material destruction. It's that too, but the material destruction occurs with the intent of achieving a psychological effect. So where does reflexive control fit in this? It is their primary method for achieving information psychological effects.
I see. Okay, so great background and summary there. One other question that could be thought of as level setting that I wanted to ask before we get into reflexive control itself. There's another nifty resource for our audience to check out. It's a 1986 thesis from the Naval Postgraduate School by Diane Chodakul. We'll have a link in the show notes for those to check it out. But in that report or thesis, she goes to some lengths to compare the ethics of Soviet ethics compared to Western ethics, and good versus evil, and some of the implications for Soviet strategy and engagement in the world. Do you think you could give like a super quick, 101 on some of those ethical differences and consequences?
Yeah, I think she was working off of a piece that Vladimir Lefevre wrote on the ethical choices or ethical systems between Western and Russian ways of thinking. And Vladimir Lefevre was the guy who conceived of reflexive control. So he and the actual name of the piece escapes me, but An algebraic model of ethical cognition.
It just kind of rolls right off the tongue.
Yeah. Yeah, Lefevre can be pretty trippy. When you read his material, you can really feel that his uh, his he's got so much in his mind and it's like and it comes out and it's just like la 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 la. It's like
Yeah.
his head is bursting with ideas and you really just get that sense that did he really get it all out there.
Well,
Um,
since you've mentioned him already, why don't maybe you could go ahead, just give the background on Lefevre too, because it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I'll get back to it. And actually, our friend Dr. Stuart Umpleby actually wrote a piece in about Vladimir Lefevre's theory of two systems of ethical cognition. Um, anyways, yeah, fascinating background. Vladimir Lefevre is the Soviets had this uh, discipline called mathematical psychology. And I've done a little bit of research on that to figure out because I've had students say like, well, what's that? And I'm like, well, I don't think we have something similar in the West. But it's basically using mathematical formalism to describe like psychological processes.
Mm,
So mathematical formalism is, you know, uh, it's mathematical. It's logis logism or logicism if
mm.
it goes by. And
Yeah,
so yeah, so
I'll take your word for it. Yeah.
yeah, it's like off of like George Boole from the 1850s. It's using mathematical expressions to
Hmm.
describe logic operations, and it's and the
Hmm.
history of that is that Claude Shannon used that Boolean logic for circuit design, which ends up being one of the basic, which is how our computers function off of is the logic circuits.
Bits.
So
Yeah.
yeah, but it's the and or not kind of
Hmm.
Boolean operators. Like when we search for a book in a library, we use Boolean operators, and that's the basis. But anyways, so it's similar to that. So you're going to describe a psychological process according to some sort of polynomial expression. And so he's working in a Soviet Army lab in the 1960s on automated decision-making processes. And in the Soviet Union at this time, cybernetics was on a tear. It was, Stalin banned it as being bourgeois pseudoscience. But as soon as Stalin died, it just exploded on the Soviet scene. And the attraction of cybernetics to be able to control humans like you can control machines was attractive to them because they were subject to the excesses of Stalin's mass murders. So they're like, well, we got to come up with a different way of doing this than just whacking people. So
It,
anyway,
it is
yeah.
it is actually useful to have a population after all.
Yeah, they do things.
Hmm.
Uh, so so he comes up with this idea. So he's one of these guys who are infatuated with cybernetics and uh, based on the notion of second order cybernetics. So you have right now you have two orders of cybernetics, and this one Russian professor will say, well, no, there's three, but I won't cover that. But the first order of cybernetics, Heinz von Forster, a cybernetician, Austrian physicist, uh, called it the cybernetics of observed systems. So these are engineering things that we build that are based on cybernetic processes. The second order of cybernetics is the cybernetics of observing systems. So it takes so you have an observer who's looking back at a system, and disconnected from it, but observing it nonetheless. And so you can make judgments about that kind of thing, uh, about what is being observed. So so he was enamored with it, and he thought of this notion of like, well, I can, given Norbert Wiener's, we can, first order cybernetics controlling social systems and whatever. We can, we can control people using, a cybernetic process. So so he emigrates in the early 70s. He was Jewish, and so in the early 70s, the Soviet Union allowed a lot of a lot of Jews to leave the Soviet Union, and so some went to Israel, but some went to the U.S. A lot of them settled around here in Bethesda, where I'm at. Interestingly enough. But he goes out to UC, out to California, and I think it was UC Santa Rosa, if I'm not, or UC Irvine, I think. And so he becomes a professor there, and he continued his work on reflexive control and reflexive processes writ large. So yeah, so that's
Yeah. I got you sidetracked just a little bit. Great intro or background on Lefevre. So the ethical frameworks.
yeah. So so the way that Lefevre described the different ethical systems was that the Russians look at the ethics of look to find the ethics in the result, in the end state. Whereas he contrasts that with Western ethical systems, which find the ethics in the means you use to achieve your goals and objectives. So that poses the classical you know paradox of ends versus means. Is the means that you use to achieve your ends are in the West, they have to be ethical, but in Russia, anything goes, in order that if your objective is morally and ethically correct, then anything goes to get there. So the
Right.
ends justify the means, kind of, in that scenario.
Right. And I keep hearkening back to this thesis by Chodakol from the mid 1980s. So it was, the Cold War was in full swing at that moment. Yeah, but she's got a couple of nifty little comparison charts where asking a question like, um, should a doctor conceal from a patient that he has cancer in order to diminish the patient's suffering? So, doc, give it to me straight. Do I got cancer? And in a Western, response to that would be, generally, yes, you should be upfront and tell the patient, truthfully, I'm sorry, but yes, you do have patient. Whereas in the Soviet framework, it would be acceptable to say, no, you don't. And but mapping it onto what you were just saying, Randy, it's the outcome that the Soviets are valuing most, and
Right.
and the outcome, I suppose, would be some sort of I don't know, less of a stressful life for the patient for the remaining portion of the patient's life or something, even though you're lying to the patient in the moment or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's also part and parcel of reflexive control,
Mm,
and maybe that's why Lefevre was interested in, this two forms of ethical cognition, um, and because reflexive control is involves the you know deceits and falsehoods to achieve your end. So, like in this scenario here, if the end was to ease a patient's passing, um, you would be justified in lying to that person.
hmm
And thereby that lie, that piece of information would then have an effect of, providing some peace to that person. So yeah, but
Yeah.
it's a lie. And in the Western context, a Western ethical context, if you apply this Lefevre's model to this, that would be,
hmm
questionable ethics. And also, if you're basing it on, Kantian principles, that
Mm.
you would not lie under any circumstances.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, a lesson coming from this is just to be stark, is expect Russians to lie if it suits the pursuit of their goals. And so,
Absolutely, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I
So,
mean, deception is so much a part of the Russian culture. I have this quote I use from a French uh, Auguste de Castine, I think his name was, in the 1830s. Uh, he visits Russia along the same lines as Tocqueville came to the U.S. and had provided this brilliant commentary on the U.S. So this French count is Marquis goes to Russia to do the same thing, and he comes away with like, oh my God, this place is a cesspool, because he's hanging out at the at the court at the Tsar's
mm,
court, and
mm,
so he came away, and the bottom line, the end of the day, is like his quote from his book was everything in Russia is deception.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what's interesting though is that the Russians themselves, like within the cult, they know that Putin's lying. Putin knows that they know that he's lying,
Mm,
and then there's like a general acceptance of uh, this is how we communicate. And if you're wondering, like, okay, so how does real things get done there? How does
yeah.
they have there's cultural cues in their language that tells you, like, okay, you get the picture. It's like
Wow.
when mafia guys talk to themselves and they're like, yeah, the thing that we were, yeah, oh, the thing,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
thing needs to go away. It's like you talking, sort of like
Uh-huh.
abstract communication, but the message is there. You understand the message because you understand that form of communication.
Wow. Yeah. All right. Well, okay. So this has all been a bit of background. You've described reflexive control a little bit, but I mean, let me just ask it straight. So, yeah, what is reflexive control, and why should we care? Why should government leaders care about it, or why should maybe everyday citizens care?
Yeah. I want to respond to this by addressing part of our previous your use of Chatakal's
Okay.
piece from the 80s. And I would just like to say that she did like a really great job on in that piece. And and I have to say this, that most of the material that is found out in the wild today on reflexive control is 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 grossly off. you know,
Okay. All right.
misses the target. And it's like they built, I don't know what, I have students say there's this Georgetown Security Institute paper on reflexive control that's like so totally off. And and somebody in the faculty, I don't know if it's they're passing it out, but it's really a bad gouge.
Okay.
Or when you put in a Google search, it pops up in the top 10 in your first page of results. And so people think, oh, well, that's a credible source. So where it's not really. And so what I'd like to do is provide the definition of reflexive control from the man who created it himself. So I give my students the original source material. So I would encourage anybody wanting to do work on this, just go back to the source material, Lefevre himself. Anything derivative, you could probably expect it to be off course. Anyway, so the way he defined reflexive control, that it's simply the process of conveying the basis for decision making from one person to another. Now that's kind of a simple explanation of it, but when you get into actual planning of a reflexive control operation, things get a little trippy. So I can tell when I'm like covering this in my courses, like my students' eyes become go cross. And
This is the good stuff. Yeah.
yeah, so uh but it's like the levels of reflection. And first of all, like the notion of reflection, let me just make clear what it actually is. It's not, when you think about reflex, you think about the little rubber hammer or
Mm-hmm.
mallet that the doctor uses on your reflex, or to test your reflex on your knee or something, or some sort of Pavlovian response to a stimuli. But reflexivity is actually a philosophical based term, and it's a principle of human thinking where one looks inwards to oneself, and to examine and understand your own perceptions. And so like we have this notion of reflexivity in the US related to qualitative research. So in quant or experimental research, you have an instrument by and large that measures the phenomenon that provides the data for your analysis. But in qualitative research, particularly phenomenological research, the researcher is the instrument of measurement.
Mm.
So as part
Mm-hmm.
of your validity discussion on the validity of your research, you need to talk about the reflexivity. In other words, your own background and subjective judgments. You have to put that out front. So you have to recognize within yourself, like, okay, this is where I'm from. This is the lens that I use to observe this phenomenon. And here's my mitigating strategy for ensuring, for minimizing the amount of bias in my observations. And this helps researchers, other researchers, when they look at it, it provides a degree of validity in the in the research. So this is something similar where we're looking within ourselves and understanding our own mental images and processes and perceptions in particular. And the notion of perception in reflexive control is central to it, to the notion of reflexive control.
Mm-hmm.
And perceptions are unique to each individual, and they are subjective, and they could be wrong. They could be, how the brain interprets its sensory information is not always correct, and in fact in most cases are not correct. So this is
Mm-hmm.
the playing field, so to speak, where reflexive control operates.
Mm. Just yesterday, March the 6th, we had a nifty brown bag discussion with a gentleman named Rod Corba. He's actually with the Defense Threat
Reduction.
DTRA, yeah, reduction, DTRA, Defense Threat Reduction Agency. But he gave a fantastic talk on another Soviet thinker called Vygotsky. I'm curious if you've come across Vygotsky, but it's all about inner speech and how we, as humans, we mediate between the external world and our internal world through this, inner speech phenomenon. And I'm what you were just describing a moment ago, Randy, and reflection seems related. Have you come across Vygotsky in his work, and does it integrate at all here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think I have his one of his books. Yeah, so yeah, he's also one of these adherents to this notion of reflexive thinking. And he is, it's a shame because he doesn't really have a lot of doesn't get a lot of attention in the
Vygotsky? Well, yeah,
yeah.
listen. I just heard this presentation yesterday, so
Yeah.
this is not me, combing through my vast Rolodex of information. But no, he died very young. He was like 35 years old
Yeah.
when he died, so he was just getting started on his project. So I would imagine that probably contributes maybe just to his, him being maybe a little lesser well known. And also, I think that he's most well known for the studies he did on children and how
Yes. Mhm.
children mature through some kind of a typical model of maturation as they go from babies to young children to teenagers. But so maybe he didn't extensively study adults and stuff. So anyway, I don't want to get us too sidetracked, but it seems like there's a uh, uh, Soviet Russian heritage to this kind of cybernetic and reflexive thinking.
Yeah, no, I have his book Thought and Word, and Thought and Language, actually. And yeah, no, brilliant guy. And it's unfortunate that he's born in the 1890s, so I don't know how connected we were to Russian literature in the West from the early 20th century. But yeah, so
Mhm.
he's much along the same lines. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I look up reflexive control on the interwebs, and you've cautioned us that what's out there might not be the best representation of what reflexive control is, but undoubtedly, if someone Googles reflexive control, they're going to see a phrase similar to, well, reflexive control is the process of giving your opponent a piece of information with like a predetermined outcome or something along those lines. What's your comment on that kind of a interpretation of reflexive control? It's like knowing your opponent or the player, right? I think Lefevre talked about like players in a game, right? You got player A, player B, but knowing your opponent so well that when you when you give your opponent a piece of information, you know in advance how that person is going to respond. And so it's that kind of a dynamic in order to control your opponent. So is that any kind of a faithful interpretation of Lefevre's work, or do you think that that gets people in trouble thinking about it that way?
No, it's definitely in the ballpark.
Hmm.
But it's very, very general. So if you want to think of a reflexive control operator to be a little bit more specific, if you think of the two players as you mentioned, one is the controller and one is the target. So the whole notion of reflexive control is trying to get your target to make a decision or a choice that supports your objective. So, so in that sense, of course, predetermined a decision, the whole purpose for you to, uh, to create a reflexive control operation is for you to get a decision or your target making a choice that benefits you. So in order to do that, the controller must connect to the inner world of the target. And the inner world of the target includes the perception, and it's very situational. It can't be something that is applied writ large or in general, but it's very specific to an individual or decision maker. Much like military deception has a deception target. Your deception target is defined as the one who has the authority to make the decision that accomplishes the deception objective. So it's the same thing you're trying to do here. The person you want to influence to make a decision, has to be, an individual or, and it has to be relative to the situation because you're connecting to the inner world of how that target sees a given situation and also how their decision-making process. So you need two pieces. And the decision-making process could be the personal qualities of the decision maker. It could be his cognitive biases, psychological, emotional, moral kind of stance. And if you're looking at a problem-solving algorithm, if your target uses game theory, then that becomes a variable in how you plan your reflexive control operation. But so you're looking at how that, in addition to their decision-making process, what is the perception of that target given the situation or the arena of action as Lefevre describes it as.
Yeah, wow, that's cool.
Let me,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah. So what you want to do, once you get the the information on decision-making process, how they, when it gets to a sufficient level, then you could design what Russians call information packages that are fed into their communication channels that upon which they base their decision on. So the information packages can be things, they can be real things, they could be false things, they could be symbolic things, but those are the things, the items, the information package is designed specifically to enter into a system and then elicit the exact decision or choice that you're getting after.
Right. And just to reconnect it back up to the top and talking about cybernetics, you're describing a cybernetic process where you've got an information packet that's going into a system, algorithm, and based upon observations of the system, you can I guess probabilistically estimate what the effect of that information packet is going to have, as it gets processed by the system and then gets spit out on the other side.
Right. Yeah, and it's Lefevre says it himself that this reflexive control process is considered to be second order cybernetics, which is the cybernetics of observing systems. So you as the controller are observing the inner world of your target. So you're sitting outside that target and you're trying to understand how that target sees the situation, how that target sees himself relative to that situation, and other actors, to
Mm.
include the controller. So you're trying to connect to that whole, goulash of, cognitive material in your target to plan your reflexive control operation.
Right. So do you, so I think you mentioned this a moment ago, but I just wanted to ask it directly. Is the way the Soviets practiced reflexive control, was it typically, or is it typically directed at an individual, or is it more often directed at groups of individuals or societies? Because I could imagine that the tactic or the approach would be very different. I mean, conceptually the same, but in practice, very different if you're targeting an individual decision maker versus a society, for example.
Yeah, you know, so so Lefevre wrote his first book, I think, Conflicting Structures in Russian in 1966. But it didn't seem to really um, reach a critical mass or like all of a sudden gain attention until the 1970s. And that was when the let's see, I'm trying to get the I think it was the deputy chief of staff of the Russian military wrote this book for the Russian military on how to incorporate reflexive control into military operations. And that's what, yeah, it was V.V. Druzhinin and D.S. Kontarov, Problems of Military System Design. So, and I think Druzhinin was, like I said, the second highest military. So, yeah, of course, he got a lot of attention at that point.
And
Um,
you said this is the 1960s again?
this was 1970s
Okay.
that they published that book. And just before that, I mentioned that Soviet fascination or love affair with cybernetics became such a prominent theory in their in their science and philosophy that it actually ended up displacing. You see, the Soviet Union had an official science, and dialectical materialism is the was the official Soviet science, and so all science had to be conducted within that framework, and that's a Marxist framework that whose intent was to purge the bourgeoisie out of science, and
Okay.
so uh, yeah, so because Stalin, because he looked at cybernetics as being bourgeoisie science, after he died, so it became all the rage in the Soviet Union to the extent that it displaced dialectical materialism as the official science of the Soviet Union. So by the 1970s, cybernetics was the way that all science had to be created, was the framework of all science in the Soviet Union. Uh, and so, so Lefevre's notion of reflexive control is riding that wave in the Soviet Union. So it became more of a thing after this book was published. So, you're really looking at kind of reflexive, control coming into practice, maybe the late 70s, early 80s. So, and then, another few years later, the Soviet Union collapses.
Mm, mm.
Where you see the resuscitation of reflexive control, or I don't even know if it's necessarily resuscitation or its application in a modern, contemporary information age context, but they started to, in the mid 1990s, you start to see reflexive control prominently featured in their theoretical military literature.
Mm, I see. Are there any like classic examples of reflexive control, or like known reflexive control operations that are, I don't know, published or understood?
I think no, that's a hard that's really hard to, without having access to
Hmm. Hmm.
the actual, how they actually unless we had an observer. Yeah, it's
Okay.
real.
Yeah.
But we can make inferences from the way that the Russians have conducted their contemporary operations. So, for example, Kerr Giles in his book, in his report to the Defense Department of Defense in Canada on reflexive control, he talks about the Russian operations in Georgia as being an example of reflexive control. And so he, in that specifically, how he describes it was that what the Russians did was to mass offensive forces like artillery and armor outside of Tbilisi, which caused the European Union to force the Georgians to accept the peace treaty that was favorable to Moscow, which ceded, Abkhazia and Ossetia to the Russians. So you have two Russian enclaves buried in Georgia, but the Russians definitely, we don't know for sure if the Russians intended to actually go into Tbilisi, uh, which is a question, which is a question
Hmm.
mark. But the effect of what they did, is something that you could, but there's a reflexive control playbook, and one of the plays is to, and this is Lefevre describes it as manipulate a target's goal.
Hmm.
So, and what that does is it puts a target in a position where he is provoked to select a course of action in the controller's favor. So you could make a very strong argument, which Giles does, that by moving offensive forces out and massing forces outside of Tbilisi, that forced the European Union, read the French and the Germans, to pressure the Georgians to accept the Moscow's peace treaty. So personally, I think that they were in the Ukraine, in when they invaded Ukraine, yeah, you could look at what they did in the initial invasion in 2014 with the little green men
Hmm.
as being a reflexive control operation, because what they did was they camouflaged the origin of the soldiers taking over Crimea in the eastern province of Ukraine. They disguised those soldiers, and what that did, the effect of that had they disguised and masked that, and that had the effect of giving the Russians space and time to conduct their operations while the European Union tried to figure out, or the West tried, okay, who's doing what over there, and so that had the effect of influencing the West to not intervene, to not do something.
I
And
see.
then when you look at the latest, when Russia actually invaded Ukraine, this latest iteration, uh, there was a article published by Major General Ionov in the 1990s that talked about different reflexive control, like a playbook. And so one of them was power pressure, which was demonstration of superior force, psychological attack, ultimatum, threat of force, provocative maneuvers. So you can go right down that list and see that's exactly what the Russians were doing to influence the Ukrainians to basically surrender. And
Hmm.
my own hypothesis of that, my own speculation is that the Russians got into the war accidentally because they thought that, hey, we were successful in Georgia using these type of plays, and so we could be successful and we could topple the Ukrainian government by using these same techniques. And So I think they were surprised at the resilience of, maybe they didn't do their homework
Mm,
on Zelensky enough, and
I see.
yeah, so
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, so this has been a fantastic uh, introduction to, as you said, the trippy or mind-bending world of reflexive control. Um, but yeah, but before we close out, I guess I just wanted to get your opinion on is there any, I don't know, action plan or way that Western leaders or Western societies might defeat reflexive control? If
yeah,
that's if
yeah,
that's even the right question, it might defeat
yeah.
might not be the right word. Maybe manage reflexive control or something like that.
Well, I think what we want to avoid is being manipulated into making a decision or choice that is in the best interest of somebody else or another actor, and not our own. And so I think that's what we want to avoid. And and it's part of my, to put a shameless plug in my propaganda universe. That's,
Uh-huh.
yeah, preserving our ability to make our own decisions that are in our interest, to me, is like, it's like, yeah, that's where I'm at. Anyways, so but according to Lefevre, the way an RC or reflexive control operation fails is if the target detects or suspects that is being used.
Uh,
And so therefore the key thing to do is uncovering the use of reflexive control. So in this regard, I can think of taking a page out of our counter deception techniques or methods. So um, interestingly enough, even though we don't call it that way, we have several ways of going about detecting whether deception is being used against us in the intelligence community. So one of them is, congruity, incongruity analysis, com competing hypotheses, um, and we don't ever talk about uh, being aware of our own reflection. We talk about, like, the intelligence community is so concerned about analysts building into their products, their own cognitive biases. But this is where we could take a page out of reflexive thinking, and that is, what we're doing in like, especially the alternate or the analysis of competing hypothesis. We're trying to defeat confirmation bias by, uh, by uh, arguing against our hypotheses. So we want to disprove our hypothesis as to what an adversary is doing or not, whatever their activities are, whatever intelligence that we get. We develop hypotheses as to what they're up to. And this process, what it does is tries to purge us from, like, our own, biases and confirmation biases by disproving our hypotheses. So, but the way I think about it, we're exercising a degree of reflexivity in terms of being aware of our own thinking process. In other words, we take we're like, take a little version, a mini me of ourselves outside of it, and look back in to understand what what our own processes, and what our vulnerabilities are, and what are we susceptible, because that's what this kind of manipulation takes advantage of. But along those lines, though, uh, you know we our spidey sense should start to
mm,
tingle. Little hairs I have on,
yeah,
back of
yeah,
my
yes.
head.
I see them. Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. The audience can't see them, but I
Yeah.
can. Yes.
Yeah. So they should start to tingle if all of a sudden we feel like we're being maneuvered into making a specific choice. So that should, cause our spidey senses to tingle. And something that could help us think that is if we experience a windfall of intelligence or of,
Mm,
information. Like, all of a sudden, if magical information lands in our lap that's like, oh my God, you know, it's like, okay,
This is
wait
what
a
we've
minute.
been looking for.
Am
Yeah.
I supposed to be seeing this? Yeah.
Mm.
So, and what decision is this trying to lead me towards? But it's all totally a cognitive type of cognitive. Well, this is a cognitive crucible, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so this is a cognitive process. So it's really managing that in order to being self-aware, having a degree of reflexive thinking, and realizing that we're fallible. Our cognitive process, our perception, it's subjective, it's fallible, it's mostly misleads us all the time, in a lot of cases, most
Hmm.
cases. So yeah. So and finally, the other thing, very specific thing that could help us, avoid making is that nothing nothing false can be so perfect without being the real thing.
Whoa,
So
whoa,
it
what are you saying? Nothing false can be so perfect as to be the real thing. So
what,
like a deception attempt being something
yes,
false it's not going when when you start scratching at it a little bit more, it'll either slowly or quickly become obvious that it's not truthful or something.
absolutely, yes,
like
that's
like
correct.
like in inflatable tanks, right?
Right.
During World War II. If you investigated it further, you'd quickly find that it's a deception.
Yeah, absolutely. And Barton Whaley, the Aristotle of deception theory, uh, you know, he he says with every crime, there are within that within that crime, there are two ways to solve the crime. Something's been either taken away or something's been added to. So, so the more you dig down into something, the deception will reveal itself the more that that you drill down into something.
Hmm.
Uh, so so yeah, so you can't replicate reality perfectly. And
Uh,
at a certain point in time, you're gonna discover it's fake. So
huh. All right, interesting. Do you think the same applies to deep fake technology and where that's going? A previous episode, we'll put a link in the show notes, but on episode 100, actually, it was with Rand Waltzman, I
yep.
remember. But we talked about the metaverse and like AR, VR technology, and he is positing that one day it will be impossible, or maybe not literally impossible, but practically impossible to tell the difference between um, you know uh, AI generated content and real life content. Or and he even talks about how facial software can identify what the viewer's face looks like and modify the AI face just slightly so that the AI generated face has some features that just slightly resemble the viewer's face, and it's
Mhm.
imperceptible. But that kind of a facial manipulation to make, oh, I don't know, President Biden or Putin's face or anybody's face look just a little bit more like your face, that that is potentially a devastating influence technique for all kinds of purposes. But anyway, I think what you're saying would still apply, though. I mean, if you really start investigating it closely, you could probably say, "Oh, wait a minute, this is not exactly this is not real." But it's getting harder and harder and harder. Would you say that that's right at least?
Yeah, no, yeah, I think you're practically speaking, how we the degree to which you exert resources and cognitive resources to figuring something out
Mm.
depends upon your, motivation and your involvement in something. So, as a practical matter, if you're just existing in this metaverse thing of like all, so, you know, are you chances are you're not going to dig really deep. Chances are you're going to process that as
Mm.
like,
Mhm.
okay, at face value. But I think you'd have to, we do have digital sleuthing technology and organizations who dig down into the, because they're, the purpose of their organizations is dig down. I think the Digital Forensics Research Lab, DFRL, I think, those guys, Bellingcat, they have the requisite expertise to drill down on things and determine whether, they are, real or fact. But the notion is that, when you drill down, you'll find a flaw in there somewhere.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, Randy. Just usually ask a couple of typical closeout questions. Do you have a research question that an interested student might take a crack at in order to help answer some unanswered questions in this area?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking this question because I always try and, throw the, you know, throw the bait for my students out there on reflexive control. And I even had a student who had a PhD in mathematics. And I tried to dangle the mathematical psychology that's involved with
Yeah.
reflexive control in front of him.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. He
yeah,
was
I've had
like, yeah, pass. Yeah.
yeah, and I've had note takers in the 8 years I've been teaching. And so you know, so sure. Would I like the research question uh, that if anybody's out there interested digging into, I think this is a good one. But basically, it's how can reflexive processes be applied in the creation of strategies to obtain desirable results in scenarios of conflict, competition, or cooperation. So it's almost like using reflexive control for a certain kind of game theory, like
Mm.
reflexive game theory kind of thing. And I because it forces you, because I mean the big thing that the reason why like I'm really that attracts me to this notion of reflexive control is that it forces us into if you follow the process, it forces us into the inner world of of your target.
Mm.
And a lot of times we treat that as a ball bearing, right? If that makes
Mm.
sense. Like, a black box. And when we do things at a, strategic, like, and we're formulating strategy over whatever it may be, military operational design and everything else like that, you know, the part that would yield us the biggest rewards is to actually connecting to the inner world of our opponent, adversary, target, decision maker, or
Mm.
whatever. And I think that should be the basis of how we plan an operation. Because at the end of the day, a human's in the loop there somewhere. I don't care how much automation or technology, there's a human in the loop, and that's what we need to focus on.
Mm.
So, but
Is
that's just me.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Is this research question related at all to what you mentioned a moment ago? I think about like hypothesis creation and hypothesis testing and like scenario building in order to make sure that we are considering at least all of the various different possibilities that exist and not accidentally walling something off as unlikely or impossible, but trying to keep as much possibility open so that we don't accidentally blind ourselves. Do you understand what I'm trying to ask there?
Yeah, But let me just ask a clarifying question. Is that do you mean like in how we look at our adversaries, or using it for our own purposes?
I guess I was thinking more on keeping the world of possibilities open relative to adversary actions or adversary instigated possibilities. You know,
Yeah.
not accidentally excluding something that is still possible.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I was thinking that when you were talking about your research question, but maybe it's not especially related.
Well, I think if we're trying to figure out if the bad guys are using, some type of reflexive control on us, yeah, I think uh, when or if we're just trying to analyze in general, what a adversary is doing, uh, you know, I think that analysis of competing hypothesis, the process of when you do that, you're supposed to, if you're intellectually honest about how you're doing it, it's like military decision make, like you develop these courses of action, and everybody knows that the process will end up in whatever the commander wants anyways, but you go through this process.
That's
The
right.
fellow is
Well,
like
that's why
the decision maker's like, oh, well, I want cohort number 5.
right. Well, in the Marines, the joke always was, like COA number 3 is the boat raid. You throw
Yeah,
throw, throw that in.
yeah.
We're gonna go, hey diddle diddle straight up the middle. Right flank, left flank, and there's always the boat raid option too.
Well, it's Dr. Evil, oh hell, let's just do what we always do, hijack a nuclear weapon and hold the world hostage, I think. But yeah, you,
Not the sharks with laser beams.
yeah, yeah, well, that was that guy who came up with that one got screened out. It was kind of like the military. Anyways, so when you develop your hypotheses on the possible things that your adversary could be doing, that's where you don't try and screen anything out. And I think like in group kind of scenarios, I think the moderator doesn't want to, it's like, brainstorming where you're throwing a bunch of stuff up at against the whiteboard. And, you don't want to screen anything out at that point. You want to match your information that you have versus these hypotheses. And so the one special person in the group who's got, very creative ideas about things, you don't want to humiliate that person like usually happens. People snicker and ridicule that one person because their input might actually that might be the what actually the adversary is doing, something we hadn't considered before. And I hate to use the expression, but thinking out of the box.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Last question. Do you have a book suggestion to go with some of the other ones that I've captured?
Yeah, I said before, if somebody's interested in this, go to the source material. you know and so everything else is derivative, and often gets it wrong. There's Russian nuances that are missing in how we interpret things, that if you go to the source himself, Vladimir Lefevre, that will give you the best head start of everything. So I recommend The Structure of Awareness by Vladimir Lefevre. That's what I provide to my students as a source material. So I recommend anybody interested in it start with that, and then go to chapter 5 on, maybe go like the first chapter and then go to chapter 5, which is a specific description of reflexive control, because the structure of awareness goes into his mathematical psychology kind of thing, and modeling human consciousness, and all that. So that gets really trippy.
All right. Excellent suggestions. Great discussion. And with that, Randy Rosin, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for having me. And as always, I always enjoy the conversation.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.